Barron Trump immediately destroys a liberal TV host during a live broadcast. His response shocks all of America. Before we get into the details, let me know in the comments where you're watching this video from. The studio pulsed with electric tension, golden lights casting a dramatic glow as cameras honed in, ready to capture history. Millions watched breathless, sensing this was no ordinary interview. This was a battleground. At the helm sat Madeleine Carter, a journalist feared for her razor-sharp questions, a master of breaking even the strongest. But tonight, across from her sat Barron Trump, calm, unreadable, stepping into the arena for the first time. As the opening music faded and the world leaned in, one question remained: who would emerge victorious? Across from Madeleine Carter sat Barron Trump. He wasn't a politician, not yet. He wasn't a public speaker or a seasoned media player. But there was something about him, an unshakable calm, a quiet confidence that made people lean in a little closer, wondering if they were about to witness something remarkable. Dressed in a sharp, dark suit, Barron sat with an almost unnatural ease. He wasn't fidgeting. He wasn't shifting uncomfortably. His hands rested lightly on the table, and his gaze met Madeleine's without a hint of nervousness. The studio's theme music faded. The murmurs of the crowd died down. The show had officially begun. Madeleine arched a brow, her lips curving into a knowing smirk. "Barron," she began, her voice smooth, controlled, laced with just enough challenge to set the tone. "This is an interview a lot of people have been waiting for." Barron gave a slight nod. "Is that so?" Madeleine leaned forward slightly, her sharp eyes locked onto his. "You're a name people recognize, but few actually know you." A pause. A smirk. "That changes tonight." The air in the room tightened. The game had begun. Madeleine wasn't new to high-stakes conversations. She had made a name for herself by peeling back the carefully crafted facades of the world's most impenetrable figures. But tonight, she wasn't facing a politician with rehearsed talking points or a Hollywood star with a scripted agenda. She was facing a young man who had spent his entire life in the public eye without ever stepping into the spotlight himself. Until now. Madeleine adjusted her posture, fingers tapping lightly on her desk. She was in control here. Every question had been meticulously prepared, designed to push, prod, and reveal. She smiled just slightly. "For someone born into such a powerful legacy, you've managed to remain quite the mystery," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "People have seen you, but they haven't heard you. Why is that?" It was a question with a trap built into it. If Barron dodged, it would make him seem hesitant, unsure. If he answered too boldly, he risked giving away more than he wanted to. But Barron? He didn't hesitate. He leaned back ever so slightly, his movements slow and deliberate. When he spoke, his voice was steady. "Silence isn't always absence," he said simply. "Sometimes it's preparation." A murmur rippled through the audience. It wasn't a defensive answer. It wasn't an evasion. It was control. Madeleine's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker in her eyes, acknowledgement. If subtlety wouldn't shake him, she'd have to turn up the heat. "You've been in the public eye your entire life, whether you wanted to be or not," she pressed. "Do you ever feel like people have already decided who you are before you've even had a chance to show them?" Another trap. If he admitted to feeling misunderstood, he'd appear weak. If he denied it, he'd come across as out of touch. Barron exhaled softly, unshaken. He let the silence stretch just a little longer than expected before he answered. "Perception is an interesting thing," he said. "It usually says more about the people looking than the person being observed." Madeleine's fingers twitched against the desk. He wasn't just answering. He was redirecting. This wasn't a young man caught off guard. This was someone who had come prepared. Madeleine adjusted her posture, her smirk widening just slightly. This was going to be fun. Madeleine Carter knew when an interview was about to take a turn. She had spent years mastering the art of control, pacing conversations, setting traps, waiting for the moment her guests would slip. But Barron Trump wasn't slipping. If anything, he was leading. She placed her notes down, folding her hands neatly on top of them. A silent message. She didn't need them to dismantle him. "Let's talk about your name," she said, her voice smooth but edged with challenge. The last name, Trump, is one of the most polarizing in modern history. It carries weight, power, controversy. Whether you like it or not, it has shaped how people see you. She paused, just long enough to let the audience absorb the moment. But has it shaped how you see yourself? The question hung between them, heavy with expectation. Barron didn't flinch. He didn't shift in his seat or glance away. Instead, he let out a slow, measured breath. Everyone is shaped by where they come from, he said finally. But the difference between being shaped and being defined is a matter of choice. Madeline let the answer sit. It was clean, polished, a near-perfect sidestep. But she wasn't about to let him slip away that easily. You speak about choice, she pressed, leaning forward ever so slightly. But how much choice have you really had? You were born into wealth, influence. You didn't have to fight for a place at the table. You inherited it. Would you say that's privilege? A loaded question. If he admitted to privilege, he risked alienating those who resented power. If he denied it, he would be branded as detached from reality. But Barron didn't rush. He didn't let the tension force an answer out of him. Instead, he offered a faint, almost imperceptible smile. Privilege is an interesting word, he said. If a doctor's child grows up with access to the best education, are they privileged? If a musician's son grows up surrounded by music, is that privilege? Or is privilege just another way of saying that some people start their journey differently? Madeline's fingers twitched. He wasn't answering the question, he was reframing it, reshaping the conversation itself. So you acknowledge it then, she pushed. Barron nodded slightly. I acknowledge that no one chooses where they start, he said smoothly. Only where they go from there. A ripple passed through the audience. Some nodded in quiet approval. Others exchanged glances. Madeline recognized the shift immediately. He wasn't just evading. He was leading. If she let him keep control, she would become the one on the defensive. She pivoted. Fair enough, she said, shifting gears. Let's talk about something that isn't defined by privilege. A pause. Public scrutiny. The tension in the room thickened. Unlike the rest of your family, you've managed to stay out of the media's direct line of fire for most of your life. She tilted her head. Until now. She let the moment stretch. Let the audience feel the weight of it. Then, with deliberate slowness, she asked, why step into it now? For the first time, something flickered in Barron's eyes. It wasn't uncertainty. It was calculation. He took his time before answering, his demeanor as controlled as ever. Because silence isn't always the best response, he said finally. Sometimes, people don't just need to hear stories. They need to hear them from the right voices. Madeline's gaze narrowed. It was subtle but pointed. This wasn't just about him answering questions. This was about him challenging the very nature of the media itself. So, you believe you're the right voice? She asked. Barron didn't hesitate. I believe that people deserve to decide that for themselves, he countered. The room pulsed with energy. The conversation had shifted from politics to something deeper. Madeline knew she had to move fast. She leaned back, adopting a more casual pose. All right, she said lightly. Let's take your name out of the equation. She gestured vaguely. Imagine you weren't a Trump.
No legacy. No recognition.
A pause. Do you think people would still be listening to you right now? Barron exhaled, and for the first time that night, something in his expression changed. It wasn't uncertainty. It was something sharper. People listen to me because of my name, he admitted. Then, with a knowing glint in his eyes, he added, but if I had nothing worth saying, would they still be listening now? The room erupted. Applause. Murmurs. Sharp glances exchanged between audience members. It was an answer that not only neutralized the attack, but turned it back on her. Madeline pressed her lips together, quickly suppressing the smallest flicker of irritation. She had spent her career controlling interviews, dictating the narrative.
But tonight?
Barron Trump wasn't here to be led. And she knew she had to change tactics fast. Madeline Carter wasn't used to being the one caught off guard. She had interviewed presidents, billionaires, cultural icons, people who had spent their entire lives perfecting the art of conversation. And yet, sitting across from a young man who had spent most of his life avoiding interviews altogether, she was the one struggling to regain control. She had come prepared for someone who would be defensive, hesitant, maybe even a little unsure. Instead, she was facing someone who wasn't just answering her questions. He was shaping them into something entirely different. Fine. Time to push. All right, she said, her voice dropping slightly, sharpening. Let's get to the real question. She leaned in, her presence filling the space between them. You've spent this interview defining yourself, challenging perception, controlling the conversation. A pause. Then, with a slow, deliberate edge, she asked, "But let's ask the question people really want to know. Are you stepping into politics?" For the first time all night, Barron hesitated. It was only for a second, a fraction of a beat. But Madeline caught it. Then, just as quickly, his composure returned. He exhaled slowly, offering a small, knowing smile. "I won't enter politics just because my last name is Trump," he said. "But I also won't avoid it just because people think I shouldn't." The silence in the room deepened. It wasn't a yes. It wasn't a no. It was something far more deliberate. A statement of intent without giving anything away. Madeline realized what had just happened. He hadn't just answered the question. He had left it open-ended, allowing the audience to interpret it however they wanted. He had given them just enough to speculate, just enough to talk, just enough to make headlines. And just like that, she realized he wasn't playing defense. He was playing the long game. Madeline took a slow breath, exhaling carefully. She had one last move left. She smiled, sharp and knowing. "All right, Barron," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "If you truly believe in defining your own path, let me ask you this." The air tightened. The moment stretched. If one day America asked you to lead, would you say yes? The audience collectively held its breath. The stage was set. The real battle was about to begin. For the first time in the entire interview, the energy in the studio shifted. This wasn't just a question. This was a moment that could change the course of history. The camera zoomed in just enough to capture the flicker of thought in Barron's piercing blue eyes. The audience barely breathed, waiting for the response that could shift the conversation from intellectual sparring to historical significance. Barron didn't rush. He let the moment stretch, not out of hesitation, but out of control. It was a technique he had used all night, refusing to let the question dictate his pace. Finally, he exhaled softly and leaned forward slightly. "The real question," he said, his voice smooth but deliberate, "is not whether I would say yes." A pause. "The real question is whether America is ready for a different kind of leader." A ripple passed through the audience. Whispers spread like an electric current. Madeline's expression remained unreadable, but inwardly, she recognized the brilliance of the response. He hadn't confirmed anything. He hadn't denied anything. He had taken the question and reshaped it into something that left the public, not him, grappling for an answer. She tilted her head slightly, lips pressing together in thought. He was good. Better than she had anticipated. "So, you're saying you would consider it?" She pressed, her tone measured. Barron gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "I'm saying leadership isn't just about wanting the position," he replied. "It's about whether the position is ready for what you bring to it." Madeline inhaled slowly. He was giving the audience something to hold on to without ever giving her what she wanted, commitment. It was a tactic she had seen seasoned politicians use. Yet here was this young man, still untouched by the machine of politics, wielding it effortlessly. She shifted gears. "Let's talk about responsibility," she said. "Regardless of whether you choose to enter politics or not, you carry a last name that comes with history. Some of it admired, some of it criticized." Her gaze sharpened. "Have you ever, at any point, felt burdened by the expectations that come with it?" A carefully crafted strike. Barron's expression remained calm, but something flickered in his gaze, an acknowledgement that he had been waiting for this moment. "The burden isn't the problem," he said finally. A pause. "The challenge is how you choose to carry it." The audience reacted, murmurs rising in pockets throughout the studio. Madeline nodded, unfazed. That's a thoughtful answer, Barron, but let's be real for a moment. She leaned in slightly, her voice sharpening. You've spoken tonight about defining yourself, about not letting your last name dictate your future. But whether you like it or not, people will always see you as your father's son first. She let that sink in. Do you think you can ever truly escape that shadow? A calculated strike. Barron studied her for a moment, his gaze unwavering. Then, he leaned back slightly, exuding the same composed confidence he had maintained all night. I don't need to escape a shadow, he said, his voice even. A pause. I just need to stand in my own light. The room erupted. Applause broke out, some audience members rising to their feet in admiration. Others remained seated, processing what they had just heard. Madeline, for the first time, allowed herself a small smile, not of triumph, but of recognition. She had spent years breaking down political figures, unraveling their carefully crafted personas. But tonight, she wasn't dealing with someone who needed to hide behind a persona. She was dealing with someone who knew exactly who he was. Still, she had one final card to play. She let the applause settle before speaking again, her voice quieter, but more piercing than before. Since we're talking about standing in your own light, she said, let's address the other question on everyone's mind. The energy in the room shifted. Even Barron's expression grew slightly more serious. Madeline didn't hesitate. Your father has been one of the most controversial leaders in recent history. Some revere him. Others believe he was the most divisive figure of our time. She let the weight of the words settle before continuing. Tell me, Barron, have you ever, even for a moment, been ashamed of something he has said or done? A sharp intake of breath rippled through the crowd. It was the question, the one that could define the entire interview. A no would paint him as blindly loyal, unwilling to acknowledge flaws. A yes would be seen as an outright betrayal of his father's legacy, an admission that would make headlines around the world. For the first time that night, the tension in the studio was almost suffocating. But Barron Trump did not flinch. He did not shift. He did not let the weight of the question force his hand. Instead, he simply asked, have you ever been ashamed of something President Biden has said or done? The reaction was immediate.
Gasps.
Scattered laughter. Even a few hushed whispers of admiration. He had flipped the script in a single sentence. Madeline blinked. She had prepared for countless responses. But not this. And for the first time all night, she was the one on the defensive. Madeline's carefully maintained composure didn't falter, but something in her expression shifted. A fraction of a second, barely noticeable, but enough. Barron had done something few had ever managed. He had turned the question back on her, forcing her into the uncomfortable position of answering the very type of question she had spent her career crafting for others. She exhaled softly, regaining her rhythm. This isn't about me, Barron, she countered smoothly. This is about you. Barron met her gaze evenly. Isn't it, though? He asked, his voice calm-measured. You're a journalist. Your job is to challenge assumptions, to make the public think. So tell me, why is it a fair question to ask if I'm ashamed of my father, but if I ask you the same about President Biden, suddenly it isn't? A wave of murmurs rippled through the audience. Madeline's lips parted slightly, as if she were about to respond, but then she stopped herself. She knew the weight of this moment. If she dismissed his point outright, she'd lose credibility. If she answered it, she'd be playing into a strategy. A lose-lose. She inhaled, adjusting her posture. You're right, she admitted. I ask tough questions. It's what I do. But I'm not running for office. I'm not the son of a former president. The public doesn't need to know where I stand. They need to know where you stand. Barron leaned forward slightly. And maybe, he said, they need to hear a journalist acknowledge that some questions are designed not to reveal truth, but to create division. The tension in the room was palpable. For the first time, Madeline felt the power dynamic slipping. She had come prepared to challenge him, to unravel him. But Barron Trump wasn't unraveling. He was making a statement, not just about himself, but about the very system that had put him in this chair tonight. She knew she had to pivot. Fair enough, she said, her voice light but firm. Let's bring this back to you. The audience settled. You've spent this interview proving that you can handle pressure, that you can hold your own, she said. But let's cut through all of that. At the end of the day, do you truly know who you are? Or are you just a product of media perception? A dangerous question. One that could shake even the most prepared guests. Barron didn't hesitate. If I were just a name, he said, his voice calm, then why am I sitting here answering these questions myself? The room erupted into applause. Madeline's expression didn't change, but deep down, she knew she had set the stage for an interrogation. Instead, Barron Trump had turned it into a declaration. And for the first time all night, she realized she wasn't the one in control anymore. The interview was over, but the conversation had only just begun. As soon as the cameras cut to commercial, the studio audience erupted into whispers, some excited, some stunned. Madeline leaned back in her chair, studying Barron carefully. You handled that well, she admitted, a trace of something almost like respect in her voice. Barron smiled faintly. So did you. She let out a small chuckle, shaking her head. I have a feeling this interview is going to be talked about for a long time. Good, Barron replied simply, standing up and adjusting his suit. That was the point. He extended his hand. For a moment, Madeline hesitated, then, with a small smile, she took it. As he stepped off the stage, his security team already moving toward him, the studio crew was still buzzing. Producers whispered into their earpieces. Journalists in the audience scrambled to jot down notes. The headlines were already forming. Barron Trump stuns in first major interview. The next generation of Trump. Is he ready? Media trap backfires. Barron turns the tables on host. But Barron Trump? He wasn't thinking about headlines. He had done what he came to do. And as he walked through the backstage hallway, his phone already buzzing with messages, he knew this was just the beginning. All Americans, the whole country, and the whole world was watching him.